December 1944. A cold rain falls over the Ardennes forest. The roads are rivers of mud, deep, sucking, unforgiving. A column of American tanks crawls forward, each one fighting the earth itself as much as the enemy ahead. At the crest of a ruined village road, a group of German officers watches through binoculars. They smirk beneath their greatcoats. The Americans, they believe, are hopeless mechanics in overgrown tin cans, unfit for the mud and might of Europe. One Sherman sinks to its tracks. Another grinds, stalls, and smokes. The Germans laugh quietly, boots stamping in the wet dirt. Then, a third tank pushes forward. Its treads churn relentlessly. Its engine, a throaty growl, doesn't falter. One by one, the others come alive again, mechanics jumping into the muck with wrenches and cables, coaxing steel back to life. The line reforms. The column moves. The laughter fades. Because that day, the Germans began to understand. The war was no longer about the strongest machine, but the one that never stopped. In 1939, when Europe ignited, the United States was still a sleeping giant. Its factories built cars, not tanks. Its soldiers trained with wooden rifles. Across the Atlantic, Hitler's armies rolled across Poland, Denmark, and France with terrifying precision. The Blitzkrieg had arrived. Fast-moving panzer divisions cut through defenses that were supposed to hold for months. To the watching world, Germany had redefined modern warfare. In the halls of Washington and Detroit, this reality hit like a thunderclap. America had no tank that could stand against the German Panzer III or I-4. The M2 light tank, America's early attempt, was little more than a steel shell on tracks. When Britain faced the full force of the Wehrmacht in 1940, it became clear the next war would be fought and won not only by soldiers, but by engineers. By 1941, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department and the newly formed armored force began to mobilize industry. The result was the M3 Lee, a tall, awkward machine with a side-mounted 75mm gun. It was an improvement, but far from ideal. Its height made it an easy target, and its design clashed with the sleek, sloped armor of the German tanks. American mechanics in the North African desert quickly discovered its limits. Sand clogged its filters, heat warped its engines, and maintenance became a daily battle. Yet from those failures came a philosophy, a distinctly American one. The United States would not design for perfection. It would design for production. Factories that once made refrigerators and automobiles began to retool. Detroit's Chrysler Arsenal, Ford's massive River Rouge complex, and hundreds of subcontractors turned into the beating heart of America's armored might. Engineers worked around the clock. They studied the failures of the M3, listened to field reports, and sought a tank that could be fixed as easily as it could be built. When the M4 Sherman prototype rolled out in 1942, it was not the most beautiful tank on the battlefield. It was boxy, simple, even plain. But beneath its steel, it carried something revolutionary, a philosophy of reliability. The Sherman was built with standardized parts, interchangeable components, and mechanical systems that any field mechanic could repair under fire. As it arrived in North Africa, British tank crews, battered from fighting panzers in their underpowered crusaders, welcomed it. The Sherman could take punishment and keep moving. Its radial engine, borrowed from aircraft designs, roared with power even in harsh conditions. Crews began to call it the dependable one. But in Germany, the officers who saw the first reports laughed. They compared it to their panzers, heavier, better armored, more elegant. To them, the Sherman was crude mass production, an American assembly line toy, not a warrior's weapon. What they didn't understand was that the tank's true power wasn't in its gun or its armor. It was in its numbers and the men who kept them running. In workshops behind the front, American mechanics, many barely out of high school, became as vital as any rifleman. They learned to pull engines from a Sherman in hours, to weld and patch under artillery fire, to turn a crippled machine into a moving fortress again. By the time of Operation Torch in late 1942, the Sherman had proven its worth. But it was only the beginning. The real test would come when mud replaced sand, and Europe's frozen roads swallowed entire armies. The Americans were ready to mass produce. The Germans were ready to laugh. Only one of them would keep rolling when the laughter stopped. By 1943, the world's battlefields had transformed. What began as the rapid conquests of the Axis had hardened into a global struggle of endurance. The United States, now fully awake, became an industrial volcano, spewing out planes, ships, and tanks faster than any enemy could destroy them. In this furnace of production, the M4 Sherman became not just a tank, but a symbol of America's strategic philosophy: quantity with reliability. While German engineers designed tanks as masterpieces, each one intricate, customized, and complex, American engineers focused on what could be built in thousands. The Sherman's strength was standardization. Its armor plates could come from Pittsburgh or Chicago, its engines from Detroit or Cleveland, its treads from any of a dozen factories. Every bolt, every gear fit every other Sherman. That meant that no matter where the tank broke down, Sicily, Normandy, or the Ardennes, mechanics had what they needed to fix it. This approach was not born from carelessness, but from calculation. The U.S. Army understood something Germany refused to accept. Wars are not won by the best tank on paper, but by the last tank still moving. The Sherman was designed to move, fast, far, and constantly. Its relatively light weight allowed it to cross bridges that German Tigers couldn't. Its mechanical simplicity made it far easier to repair than any Panther. And though its armor could not always stop an 80 dB shell, it could be patched and reinforced in the field. American crews often welded spare track links or steel plates to the hull, battlefield improvisations that told their own story of survival. German officers, however, saw this pragmatism as weakness. To them, the Sherman was inferior. A rolling coffin, as some mocked. They measured strength in thickness of armor and caliber of gun. They looked at the Sherman's 75mm cannon and saw an easy kill. They didn't see what lay behind it: a supply chain that never slept. As the war deepened, the contrast between philosophies grew sharper. German factories, bombed and blockaded, could produce a few hundred Panthers or Tigers each month. American industry rolled out thousands of Shermans in the same time. For every German tank destroyed, 5 more Shermans replaced it. And each one could be repaired, refueled, and sent back faster than the enemy could react. The Sherman also reflected American battlefield doctrine. The U.S. didn't design it to duel heavy tanks. That job belonged to specialized tank destroyers. Instead, the Sherman was a mobile platform to support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, and dominate logistics-heavy campaigns. It was the spearhead of mobility. And in modern warfare, mobility was life. The tank's adaptability was another quiet miracle. In Italy's mountains, it became a climbing machine, its tracks gripping roads that even mules struggled to ascend. In Normandy's hedgerows, engineers welded on rhino tusks, steel prongs that turned the Sherman into a bulldozer of bocage. In the Pacific, some Shermans were fitted with flamethrowers, turning bunkers into infernos. The same basic frame served dozens of roles: recovery vehicles, artillery platforms, even amphibious versions. Wherever the Sherman went, it brought its mechanics, the unsung heroes of the armored divisions. They worked in rain, sleet, and artillery smoke, stripping engines in darkness, forging parts from scrap, keeping the steel heartbeat of the army alive. Meanwhile, the Germans continued to pour resources into their technological marvels: the Tiger and the Panther, each a masterpiece of design and a nightmare of maintenance. Their transmissions failed, engines overheated, and spare parts vanished. A Tiger tank abandoned in the mud was a monument to pride. A Sherman, dragged out by its crew, patched and running again by morning, was a monument to perseverance. By the end of 1943, American tank crews were no longer chasing parity. They were writing a new rule of war, that reliability and numbers could break genius, and, as the storm of 1944 approached, the invasion of Normandy, the liberation of Europe, the final clash in the mud of the Ardennes, those humble, often underestimated machines would carry the burden of a continent's freedom. The laughter of German officers still echoed in their command posts, but soon that sound would be drowned by something else, the unbroken rumble of engines rolling through the mud. The true heart of the Sherman wasn't its engine or its armor. It was the men who kept it alive. They weren't generals or heroes in medals. They were mechanics, grease-covered, sleep-deprived, and half-forgotten. Working in makeshift depots under tarpaulins or inside bombed-out barns, they were the lifeline of armored warfare. To them, every Sherman had a soul, a familiar hum, a particular smell of hot oil and exhaust. These men learned to diagnose problems by sound alone. They could tell a jammed track from a broken gear by the tone of the engine. And when one of their tanks limped back from the front, riddled with holes and coated in mud, they treated it like a wounded comrade. A Sherman could be disassembled, repaired, and running again within 24 hours. Field workshops carried spare engines, transmissions, and treads, each interchangeable, each designed for speed. Crews worked in pairs, lifting entire power plants with cranes, swapping burned-out parts, welding armor plates until dawn. German tankers might have boasted of precision engineering, but that precision often required a factory's attention. American mechanics had no such luxury. Their skill wasn't elegance. It was grit, improvisation. The kind of problem-solving that turned a crippled tank into a weapon again. When the rain came and the ground turned to a quagmire, the Shermans stalled and groaned, and the mechanics pushed them, dug them out, and drove them forward again. Their determination gave the tank its immortality. The Germans mocked American engineering, but they never saw the men who kept those machines breathing. German armor doctrine was born from conquest. It thrived on lightning assaults, quick victories, and short campaigns. American doctrine was different. It was born from distance. The U.S. Army had to cross oceans, deserts, and mountains to fight. It needed a tank that could be shipped, serviced, and sustained anywhere on Earth. The Sherman was the answer. Its tactical genius wasn't in head-to-head duels. It was in its mobility. On the battlefield, Shermans didn't fight alone. They fought as coordinated packs. 5 tanks, working in unison, could surround, outflank, and destroy a heavier German vehicle. What the Sherman lacked in raw power, it made up for in coordination and speed. The 75mm gun, while not the most powerful, was versatile, effective against infantry, fortifications, and most early panzers. Later variants, like the 76mm and the British Firefly modification, gave the Sherman the punch it needed against Tigers and Panthers. But even when outgunned, American commanders understood that the Sherman's advantage lay in endurance. It could fight for hours, retreat, be repaired, and return to battle the same day. A Panther might win a duel, but a Sherman company could win a campaign. That doctrine, mobility over might, became the backbone of the Allied advance. In Italy, the Shermans climbed terrain no German believed passable. In Normandy, they slogged through hedgerows with steel prongs tearing through bocage. In France, they covered hundreds of miles in days, outpacing the retreating Wehrmacht. It was a tank designed not for perfection, but for persistence. And in war, persistence always wins. Behind every Sherman on the front was a factory worker in America. A woman riveting plates, a welder joining armor seams, a machinist shaping the teeth of a gear. When President Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy, he was describing a miracle of logistics. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks, enough to equip dozens of armies. To achieve this, the United States reimagined industry. Companies that had never built military hardware learned to forge tank hulls and engine blocks. Ford Motor Company applied its assembly line genius to tanks, churning them out like automobiles. Each model was a product of efficiency. Parts could be swapped between tanks built in entirely different states. This level of production was unprecedented. Where Germany struggled to replace its losses, America built faster than the battlefield could destroy. Ships carried Shermans to every front, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma. The Sherman became the backbone not only of U.S. forces, but of the Allied world. Britain, Canada, Free France, and even the Soviet Union received them through Lend-Lease. In total, the Sherman fought under more flags than any other tank in history. Its success was not just military, it was industrial civilization turned into weaponry. Every bolt, every barrel, was a declaration of American capacity. The tank itself became a moving testament to democracy's ability to outproduce tyranny. And yet, on the battlefields of Europe, German officers still looked down their monocles and sneered at the inferior American tank. They measured victory by steel. The Americans measured it by endurance. And soon, that endurance would be tested in the worst conditions imaginable. The frozen mud of Europe, where even giants like the Tiger would suffocate. From the German high command down to the tank crews, there was a sense of mechanical superiority that bordered on arrogance. The Wehrmacht's armored corps was built upon the idea of precision, engineering as art, warfare as science. Every Tiger and Panther that rolled out of a German factory was a masterpiece of steel and mathematics. The Tiger Y, with its thick armor and devastating 80mm gun, inspired awe and terror in equal measure. The Panther, faster and more agile, was hailed as the perfect balance of firepower and protection. To German officers, these machines were proof of national genius. Tanks designed not to be repaired, but to endure. But behind that pride hid a fatal flaw. Each Tiger took twice the time to build as a Sherman, required 5 times the maintenance, and broke down constantly. Complex suspensions failed in mud, transmissions burned out, and engines overheated. A single lost part could immobilize an entire vehicle. And when factories were bombed, replacements simply stopped arriving. To the men in the field, this wasn't engineering perfection. It was a burden. Crews abandoned broken tanks because they couldn't be towed. Mechanics scavenged from one crippled machine to save another. Fuel shortages turned entire panzer battalions into stationary defenses. Still, German propaganda clung to the myth of invincibility. Films showed Tigers crushing Shermans in duels, reinforcing the illusion of dominance. Yet in reality, the Shermans were everywhere, outflanking, encircling, and returning to battle faster than the Germans could regroup. By late 1944, even seasoned panzer commanders whispered frustration. Their tanks were mighty, yes, but too few, too fragile, and too slow to fix. The same laughter that once mocked the American toys began to fade into silence. The Sherman's strength wasn't brilliance. It was survivability. And survivability wins wars. In war, complexity kills. The Sherman's genius was that it understood this before most armies did. The M4's power plant, often a Continental R975 radial engine, was originally designed for aircraft. It was robust, air-cooled, and forgiving. It didn't need delicate tuning or exotic fuels. Its transmission was rugged and could be repaired with basic tools. The suspension, though simple, provided a smooth ride and easy maintenance. Every piece of the Sherman was made with field conditions in mind. It was built to be fixed by a soldier, not a scientist. German tanks, by contrast, were high-maintenance masterpieces. Their gearboxes had over 1,000 precision components, many hand-fitted by engineers. When those parts failed, as they often did in the mud and cold, repairs could take days. A Sherman, in the same conditions, could be patched with a wrench, a hammer, and sheer determination. The Americans also embraced modularity, a forward-looking concept that made each Sherman a flexible platform. The same chassis could carry a different turret, a new engine, or serve a new role entirely. This modularity allowed upgrades in the field, constant experimentation, and adaptation to any theater. In technological terms, it was revolutionary. Instead of chasing perfection, the U.S. Army created a system, a TTTGE machine that could evolve as fast as the battlefield. When the Germans encountered Shermans that had been fitted with high-velocity, 76mm guns, or equipped with deep-wading kits for amphibious landings, they realized too late that they were facing not a single tank, but an idea. A machine that could change, adapt, and survive longer than theirs ever could. There's a sound veterans remembered long after the war. The deep, rhythmic thunder of Sherman engines. It wasn't the roar of power, but of constancy. Even when covered in mud or pierced by shrapnel, that sound returned again and again. To German troops, it became a kind of nightmare. Reports from both the Eastern and Western fronts describe a phenomenon: the endless approach. The sense that no matter how many tanks they destroyed, more came rolling through the smoke. For Allied soldiers, that same sound was hope. The Sherman was their protector, their iron companion. Infantrymen called it the house that moves. Its tracks carved paths through hell, bringing food, covering fire, and rescue. In a war that devoured men by the millions, the Sherman gave them something solid to believe in, that they wouldn't be left behind. For German commanders, it was demoralizing. Each destroyed panzer was irreplaceable. Each destroyed Sherman was just another number on a chart, soon to be replaced by a new one from across the sea. That psychological imbalance of endless supply versus finite precision slowly broke morale. And it wasn't just soldiers who felt it. Civilians, too, noticed. By 1944, as Allied columns rolled through liberated towns, the sight of Shermans, muddy, dented, still running, became a symbol of inevitability. The laughter had long stopped. Now there was only the grinding of treads, echoing through the fog. And soon, that relentless motion would meet its greatest test, in the freezing forests of Belgium, where the mud would swallow armies whole, and only one side's machines would rise again from it. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The morning began with silence. Then came thunder. German artillery shattered the stillness as the last great offensive of the Third Reich began. The Battle of the Bulge. Snow fell thick and heavy. Trees cracked from the concussions of explosions. American infantry scattered through the fog as panzers and tigers punched through the lines. Hitler's final gamble was in motion, a desperate attempt to split the Allied front and drive to Antwerp. For days, chaos reigned. U.S. divisions, caught off guard, retreated through choking snow and mud. Roads turned to slush, convoys bogged down, and frozen soldiers dug in to survive. And at the heart of that chaos, the Sherman tank once again became the difference between collapse and survival. The German High Command believed terrain and weather would neutralize the Allied armor advantage. They were half right. The snow and mud strangled everything, even the mighty Tiger. Fuel lines froze. Engines failed. Tracks cracked under the ice. But the Shermans kept moving. Their mechanics, those invisible heroes of the rear, worked through the blizzards, lighting fires beneath engines to thaw them, pouring gasoline mixed with oil to keep them alive. They turned wrecks into running machines overnight, often scavenging from destroyed tanks while shells screamed overhead. The field repair units were miracles in motion, operating like surgical teams in the open air. In one sector near Bastogne, a Sherman platoon from the 10th Armored Division faced an entire German battalion. Outnumbered, outgunned, yet they refused to stop. When one tank was hit, the crew bailed, repaired, reloaded, and went back into battle within hours. Witnesses later said the same tank fought 4 times in 2 days, each time with fresh scars, each time returning like a ghost. The Germans, accustomed to mechanical failure halting their own advances, couldn't comprehend it. They had the better guns, the thicker armor, the deadlier designs, but they didn't have movement. Shermans crawled, pushed, and clawed through the mud, often pulling each other free with cables. Engineers built bridges in hours, allowing convoys to continue when the enemy thought them trapped. American fuel convoys, under fire, often lost, still managed to deliver thousands of gallons through frozen backroads. And then, something happened that would change the tide. As German forces stretched deeper into Allied lines, their logistical lifelines snapped. Fuel depots ran dry. Panzer crews were forced to abandon perfectly functional tanks in the snow. The same arrogance that once made the Wehrmacht invincible now became its undoing. They had built machines too perfect to endure imperfection. The Shermans, meanwhile, thrived in adversity. They weren't designed for elegance. They were designed for this. When General George S. Patton ordered his Third Army to pivot north, a maneuver military historians still call one of the greatest in history, it was the Sherman that made it possible. In 3 days, his armored columns turned 90 degrees and advanced over 100 miles in snow and ice, smashing into the southern flank of the German offensive. German officers, trapped in the shrinking pocket, later recalled the horror of hearing engines in the distance. Low, grinding, and endless. The sound of Shermans, again. They came through snowdrifts and forests, headlights, dimmed, tracks grinding on frozen mud. The machines the Germans once mocked as crude were now the instruments of their encirclement. At Bastogne, surrounded American paratroopers held out while Shermans broke through the ring of steel. When the first tanks arrived on December 26th, bringing food, ammunition, and hope, the men of the 101st Airborne greeted them with tears. The German offensive was broken, not by brilliance, but by endurance, mechanical and human. When the smoke cleared, the Ardennes was a graveyard of tanks. Panthers and Tigers lay frozen, engines intact but fuel-starved, abandoned in defeat. The Shermans, filthy, battered, still idling, stood as silent witnesses to the truth. In war, perfection dies in the mud. Endurance survives it. And as winter thawed into the final months of the war, those same Shermans would lead the charge once more, rolling east toward the Rhine and into the heart of Germany itself. The laughter that began in arrogance now echoed only as memory. The tanks the Germans mocked had outlasted their empire. By February 1945, the white snows of the Ardennes had turned to brown slush and blackened mud. What was left of the German armored might was retreating eastward, battered, fuel-starved, and pursued by the relentless rumble of American armor. The Sherman had survived the winter. Now it was time to finish the war. As the Allied armies surged toward the Rhine River, the logistical miracle of the Sherman went into overdrive. Field depots churned night and day, mechanics replacing burned-out engines, refitting worn treads, and welding armor until the skies glowed red with sparks. In February alone, thousands of Shermans rolled out of repair yards in France and Belgium, restored from what had been thought beyond salvation. In the German camp, it was a different picture. The Tiger IIs, massive and terrifying on parade, had become mechanical anchors. Entire battalions halted because of a single transmission failure. Fuel reserves, already thin, evaporated under the weight of Hitler's delusion. Crews were ordered to destroy their own tanks, rather than let them fall into Allied hands. But the Shermans did not stop. When bridges were destroyed, engineers built floating pontoons. When terrain turned to swamp, bulldozers and modified Shermans cleared paths. And when the Rhine itself stood as the last great natural barrier of Germany, the tank divisions didn't wait for the perfect moment. They made one. On the night of March 22, 1945, the 3rd U.S. Army executed a daring river crossing near Oppenheim. Under artillery fire, engineers ferried Shermans across on rafts and makeshift barges. One by one, the tanks rolled onto the east bank. It was a feat that even German intelligence had declared impossible. Patton's troops didn't stop to celebrate. The next morning, as he urinated into the river and declared, "I have crossed the Rhine," his Shermans were already moving inland. Engines roaring, treads hissing, unstoppable. Every German tank that had once symbolized invincibility now became a relic of over-engineering. The mighty Panther, whose gun could pierce a Sherman at over 2,000 meters, broke down after just a few hundred kilometers on muddy roads. The Tiger II, with its 70-ton frame and 150mm gun, could barely traverse narrow bridges or forest tracks. When they did meet Shermans in combat, yes, a Tiger could destroy several before being flanked and finished. But war is not a duel. It is a system of movement, supply, and time. And time was no longer Germany's ally. By spring, American units were advancing faster than German command could respond. Shermans swarmed like schools of fish, coordinated, communicative, always on the move. When one was knocked out, another filled the gap. When fuel ran low, supply trucks arrived by the hour. A single Panzer victory meant little when the next morning brought 50 more Shermans over the horizon. In shattered villages and burned-out forests, German civilians watched this tide of steel rolling east. They saw the difference, not in size or noise, but in rhythm. The Sherman convoys didn't pause, didn't sputter, didn't break down. Even when blackened by soot or patched with rough steel, they moved with mechanical heartbeat precision. It was the sound of inevitability. By April, the Western Front was collapsing. Allied forces raced toward the Elbe River, cutting Germany in two. The once proud panzer divisions were shadows, their tanks destroyed, abandoned, or out of fuel. In those final weeks, the Sherman became both hammer and chariot. It spearheaded assaults on cities like Kassel, Nuremberg, and Leipzig, where urban warfare turned every street into a battlefield. The tank's smaller profile and reliability gave it an advantage in city fighting. It could turn, maneuver, and fire in tight spaces where the massive Tigers were helpless. In one encounter near Dessau, a platoon of Shermans destroyed a Tiger II not with superior firepower, but with superior mobility. While the German tank's gun jammed after a single shot, the Shermans flanked it, hitting from 3 directions, setting it ablaze. The German crew fled into the smoke. Their war, like their machine, was over. As the Allied armor rolled deeper into the heartland, the myth of German invincibility shattered completely. Officers who once laughed at American mechanics now stared in disbelief at the seemingly endless lines of mud-covered Shermans, each one still running, still advancing. Berlin itself fell not to the Americans, but to the Soviets. Yet even there, Shermans appeared, supplied through Lend-Lease, fighting under red stars. It was as if the tank had become a symbol of the industrial age itself, a machine that could cross ideologies as easily as it crossed continents. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. The panzers were silent. Their factories were in ruins, their fuel gone, their engineers either dead or captured. But across the fields and roads of Europe, Sherman tanks still rumbled forward. Mechanics still tinkered. Engines still turned. What had begun as an object of ridicule, a cheap tank, a mass-produced coffin, had become the machine that never stopped moving. The Sherman was not the strongest, not the deadliest, but it was the last tank running, and in war, that is the only kind that matters. As the smoke cleared and the German surrender echoed through Europe, the Sherman stood not just as a weapon, but as a monument to endurance, the machine that taught the world a simple truth: reliability, not perfection, wins wars. From that truth came a new world order, one built on the hum of engines that never gave up. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, roads torn open, bridges collapsed into rivers. Yet across the wreckage, one image persisted: the olive-drab silhouettes of Sherman tanks parked along shattered streets, their crews resting against the steel that had carried them from Normandy to the Rhine. For the Allies, the Sherman had become more than a machine. It was a symbol of perseverance, proof that discipline, adaptability, and industry could triumph over arrogance and obsession. For the Germans, it was a bitter lesson. Their mighty panzers, once celebrated as the pinnacle of engineering, now sat rusting in fields, victims of their own complexity. The statistics told the story clearly. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced 49,034 Sherman tanks, more than the total number of all German tanks combined. Each one represented the work of hundreds of men and women: welders, riveters, machinists, drivers, and mechanics, who together formed a chain of endurance that no army on earth could match. In contrast, Germany built around 1,300 Tiger I tanks and about 6,000 Panthers. Impressive machines, yes, but far too few. Even if each could destroy multiple Shermans in a duel, the math was merciless. The Allies didn't need perfection. They needed persistence. Reports from the European Theater Command confirmed what many officers had already realized. For every German tank destroyed, the Allies lost several Shermans, but they always had more to send. The logistical system, powered by relentless American industry, ensured that replacements arrived faster than the Germans could respond. This balance, or imbalance, defined modern warfare. The Sherman had proven that wars were no longer won by the finest machine, but by the most sustainable one. After the war, Allied mechanics began to inspect captured German tanks. They marveled at their construction, intricate, advanced, and elegant. But they also shook their heads. "You can't fix this in the field," one U.S. technician reportedly said while examining a Panther's transmission. "You need a factory." That was the fundamental difference. The Sherman could be repaired anywhere. German tanks could not. Post-war analyses by both sides revealed the same conclusion. Germany's obsession with quality had cost it the war of quantity. Its machines were monuments to craftsmanship. But in the mud, that craftsmanship became fragility. In contrast, the Americans had created a weapon that worked when it mattered most. The Sherman's reliability rate was astonishing. 80% of breakdowns were repairable within 24 hours. Units often fought continuously for weeks, relying on mobile workshops and mechanics who could fix or replace parts on the move. This mechanical culture reshaped military thinking. U.S. commanders learned that logistics, not heroism, determined victory. A tank that kept moving was worth more than one that could destroy anything, if it stayed operational long enough to reach the battlefield. The Sherman's role in liberating Europe cannot be overstated. From the deserts of Tunisia to the cobblestone streets of Berlin's outskirts, it was there, pushing forward, bridging gaps, surviving what others couldn't. For every German counterattack that relied on brilliance, the Allies answered with endurance. Still, that victory came with a terrible price. Thousands of Sherman crews never made it home. Their tanks, though dependable, were not invincible. Many were destroyed in ambushes, burned out in narrow French lanes, or immobilized by mines. But what made the difference was not fearlessness. It was resilience. Crews knew that replacements would come, that engineers would adapt, that they were part of something larger than themselves. The machine they rode into battle wasn't perfect, but it was faithful. To historians, this remains the Sherman's paradox. A tank mocked for its weaknesses, yet celebrated for its endurance. It was both ordinary and extraordinary, both flawed and victorious. By the war's end, the laughter that once followed American mechanics had long since died. In its place was a grudging, universal respect. Even German officers, in their post-war interrogations, admitted admiration for the Sherman's persistence. "They just never stopped coming," one captured panzer commander said. "Even when we destroyed them all, more arrived. Always more." It was not said with malice, but with awe. An acknowledgement of the simple, terrible truth that broke the German war machine. When the Second World War ended, the Sherman's journey was far from over. The tank that had rolled through the mud of Europe soon rolled into history. Not as a relic, but as the foundation for modern armored warfare. Across the globe, nations rebuilt their armies. Many of them, short on resources and experience, turned to the Sherman as their model of reliability. Thousands of surplus M4s were shipped to allies and newly formed militaries. Britain retained them in its armored regiments. France used them to rebuild its armored corps. Israel, decades later, would turn them into symbols of survival in the desert. The Sherman became the most widely used tank in post-war history, fighting in Korea, the Middle East, and beyond. It was upgraded, refitted, and modernized. Some versions remained in service into the 1980s, nearly 40 years after the laughter of those German officers had died away. Its endurance wasn't just mechanical, it was philosophical. Before the war, tank design was ruled by pride, by the pursuit of the biggest gun, the thickest armor, the most impressive specifications. The Sherman changed that forever. Its success demonstrated that systems win wars, not just machines. The Americans had created a model that future armies would follow. Modular design, logistical integration, and rapid repair. NATO's later tank doctrines, from the M48 Patton to the M1 Abrams, all descended from the lessons of the Sherman. Reliability became the cornerstone of military engineering. Every bolt, every bearing, every hydraulic seal would be judged not by perfection, but by how easily it could be replaced in the field. Germany, too, learned from its mistakes. The post-war Bundeswehr, under NATO, adopted American principles of standardization and logistics. Gone were the days of over-engineered masterpieces. The lesson of the Sherman was imprinted into Western military DNA. A weapon's true worth lies in how long it stays fighting. The Sherman was not just a tank, it was an industrial declaration. It proved that democratic societies could outproduce totalitarian ones, not through coercion, but through coordination. During the war, millions of American civilians had contributed to its creation. Every rivet, every tread, was the product of a society mobilized by purpose rather than fear. The result was staggering. A logistics system so vast that it continued to shape the world's economy long after the war ended. In the Cold War years, this production philosophy evolved into what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. Factories that once built tanks began to produce jets, missiles, and electronics. America's ability to build, to manufacture at scale, became both its shield and its symbol. The Sherman had shown that the strength of a nation was not in its perfection, but in its capacity to endure. For Germany, the aftermath was one of reckoning. Its engineers, the same men who had designed the Panzers, the Tigers, and the Panthers were forced to confront a harsh reality. Their brilliance had created marvels that could not survive a muddy road or a broken supply chain. In interviews after the war, many admitted it. Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister, reflected that Germany's obsession with technological superiority had blinded it to the practical necessities of war. "We fought battles with prototypes," he wrote later, while our enemies fought with production. The myth of the invincible panzer dissolved under the weight of numbers and simplicity. It became a cautionary tale, a warning to future militaries about the danger of designing for prestige rather than purpose. Today, when historians speak of the Sherman, they do not speak of a perfect tank. They speak of a complete idea, a machine built not for glory, but for endurance, a weapon that embodied the spirit of an army that refused to stop. Its story lives on in every armored vehicle that values reliability over spectacle, in every mechanic who knows that a repaired engine is worth more than a perfect one on paper, and in every soldier who understands that victory isn't measured by might alone, but by persistence in the face of exhaustion. Laughter that once echoed across the muddy fields of Europe became a whisper of the past, a reminder that even the proudest empires can underestimate the quiet strength of resilience. When the smoke cleared, the Sherman still stood, rusted, dented, oil-stained, but alive. And in that endurance lay the real victory. In every war, there comes a moment when the roar of cannons fades and the silence begins to speak. The story of the Sherman tank is written in that silence, in the muddy tracks that stretch across Europe, in the echoes of engines that refused to die, in the quiet persistence of men who believed that endurance was its own form of courage. The Germans had laughed once. They had laughed at the crude shapes, the simple bolts, the rough engines. But war, as history always reminds us, is not a contest of pride. It is a test of will. The Sherman proved that perfection is fragile, but resilience endures. It showed that a nation's strength lies not in its most brilliant machines, but in the people who keep those machines alive. The mechanics in the cold, the welders in the dark, the soldiers who patch a tank and push forward again. Its engine was not the most powerful, its armor not the thickest, but it carried something far more important: continuity. Every time a Sherman roared back to life from the mud, it carried with it the spirit of persistence that defines humanity itself. Even decades after the war, when newer and sleeker tanks rolled onto the stage, the lessons of the Sherman remained. Every military that followed would remember what it taught: that reliability is a weapon, that simplicity is a kind of genius, and that the measure of power is not in what can be built, but in what can endure. In the end, the laughter of arrogance was drowned by the sound of steady engines, not fast, not glamorous, but unstoppable. And as history looks back, one truth stands firm beneath the mud and steel: